in 3, 2, 1, go. Welcome everybody, happy Thursday. Hopefully everybody's been having a really great week and you all are very excited to jump into another great chat and learn with Power to Fly. In case you haven't joined us for one previously, my name's Meg. Hi, nice to meet you. I'll be your host today. And as part of the Power to Fly virtual event hosting team, I am super excited to get to host events like this. It's one of my favorite, it's absolutely my favorite part of my job. So thank you all so much for joining us. We're gonna go over a couple quick housekeeping items. Apologies if you've joined us previously, this will all be kind of repetitive, but I'll try and get through it quickly for y'all. So like I said earlier, today's event is all about our participants. So it's about you, our community, and making sure that the time that you spend with Power to Fly is time well spent. So to that end, you are highly encouraged to participate. You can do that in a couple different ways. You can turn your cameras on if you'd like. Messy buns, non-traditional workspaces, hurry coworkers, all of these things are greatly encouraged. You do not have to be insta-perfect to join us today. If you do come off mute for whatever reason, to ask a question or comment, you will show up on the live recording of today's session. Whether you've got your camera turned on or if you just have an avatar or your display name, that is what will show up on the recording. So if you have any kind of privacy concerns and you don't want to show up on the recording, no worries, you can still participate. You are just going to put your question or comment into the Zoom group thread instead. You can also DM me directly if you want to stay super, deep cover and don't want anyone to know you're here, but that way you can still participate. I'll keep your questions and comments anonymous. Now, if you do want to come off mute to ask a question or add comments, awesome, super encourage it. Just make sure that you're only coming off mute to ask your question, like when you're actively speaking. Please try not to interrupt our amazing speaker or one of our other attendees. Meanwhile, I get paid to fill the silence, so please feel free to interrupt me to make sure that you get your question asked. Like I said, today's session is being recorded, so don't feel like you have to take notes or you don't panic if you miss something that someone says. You can always go back and rewatch the recording later. So everybody that registered for today's session, regardless of whether you come for the full 60, you only drop in for about 10 or 15 minutes, or if you signed up for this knowing that it wasn't going to work for your schedule, but you still wanted to catch the recording later, hi future viewers, y'all are, everybody that registered is going to get a link in an email in about 1 to 2 business days to where you can rewatch this recording. Now, if Diana says something absolutely amazing today and you cannot wait to share it with a coworker or a friend or a family member, no worries. You can always head over to our YouTube channel. We are at Power to Fly on YouTube, and you can check out the recording there. We're going to be live streaming during today's session, but you'll be able to look at the recording for this within about 5 to 10 minutes of the end of today's session. So you can always share those links with everybody that you'd like. It's always free to watch our videos. So please, please, please feel free to share the love. You can also shout us out on social media if you'd like. We really encourage everybody to share the love and share the knowledge and let other people know about this great resource that they can take advantage of. So please feel free to keep up with us. You can shout us out on a ton of different social media. We are at Power to Fly on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, as well as YouTube, obviously. So please feel free to, kind of connect with us there or share with us what you are learning with us on our chat today. Let's see. We'll go over our questions here in just a moment. But before we get started, I would love to introduce you to our amazing speaker today. So Diana Zhang is the CEO and co-founder of NeighborShare, a rapidly growing direct giving approach that empowers our community's frontline heroes to help families through critical moments of need of $400 or less. Prior to that, she spent 15 years in strategy and operations as an executive at Bridgewater Associates, which is a premier asset management firm with $150 billion AUM. Outside of work, Diana is passionate about food. You can connect with her via her social, she posted right there, and advocating on behalf of those who lack access to it. She serves on the board of Connecticut for Food Bank and Food Share. So welcome, Diana. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Megan, and also Power to Fly for just having me today. Such an honor to be here. And also just thank you for everyone who joined. I really hope that what we cover today will end up being helpful to each of you in some way. And yeah, I'm just overall really excited to be here. So thanks, Meg.
We're so excited to have you. I'm really, really eager to dig into these questions. But before we do, can you give us a brief rundown of NeighborShare for people who have never heard of it before, as well as maybe a little bit of the background of how you decided to start it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. So as Meg briefly mentioned before, NeighborShare is a startup nonprofit with a mission to empower what we call our community's frontline heroes. So, think our case managers at our nonprofits, teachers at our schools, nurses at hospitals. We wanted to give that population a new resource they can go to help families through critical moments of need of $400 or less. And, in a country where 40% of Americans can't afford a financial emergency of that size, just $400 or less, right, without spiraling into debt. I can sure tell you that the NeighborShare team and I, we certainly feel a crazy sense of urgency toward achieving our mission. And, and our ambitions are big. We're here to launch a national movement. And, we want to help thousands, if not tens of thousands of families across the country really as quickly as possible. In terms of a bit of background on just a NeighborShare story, I co-founded NeighborShare with a small team of volunteers last April. And that was during a time that I'm sure is all vivid in our minds still, right? Like pandemic first hits, world shuts down, and we're all sent home to work from home. And so this small team and I, we just got struck with this intense sense of urgency and energy to do something to help our communities. And then even from day one, though, we really wanted to build something that could sustain, right? Like we weren't here to build something that made ourselves feel good about ourselves for a couple months and then disappear, because certainly the types of everyday emergency needs we strive to help with at NeighborShare, they existed before the pandemic and they're sure going to exist after, right? So we really wanted to make something last. And just to give you a bit of context into our team, because I think that's important context for folks to hold as we go into sort of the Q&A section. I think that there are many things that we do at NeighborShare that are unique, not in the least of which is how we're doing it. I think we're as much a tech startup as we are a nonprofit, and we're also currently 100% volunteer powered, really myself included. And, the team at this point, and if you also include our board of directors and our advisory council, we're over 40 people strong all over the country. And, these are people who are largely experts in their fields and their day jobs. And then they come and they lend their expertise to building out NeighborShare, nights, weekends, throughout the day, like wherever they can fit it in, right? And, we have everything from marketers to writers, product designers, engineers, and we also range in experience levels. Like we literally have 3 18-year-old volunteers who are awesome and are taking a gap year before they start college, to, our board members who are, truly industry leaders from world-class companies like Bridgewater, Alibaba, Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse. And, so even though no one's paid to do what they do for NeighborShare, I really think of my role every day as being the CEO of actually like a pretty sophisticated and fast growing startup, right? Like I don't hold my role as a volunteer gig and I don't treat our volunteers as traditional volunteers, right? Like if you join NeighborShare, you've joined a company with a real mission and you're taking on a real role and real responsibilities. And then there just happens to be the twist that you're not getting paid, right? And so I share this context because I hope, everyone will find what we discussed today to be helpful and also applicable to just their normal day jobs. And not interpret sort of everything I'm saying as just a conversation about how to manage volunteers in that narrow sense, right? Because in all ways, like my team is my team and we're here and we're a real company.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That gives me so much more clarity. Even in the research that I did on you, this really helps give me so much more clarity, not only about NeighborShare and the way it kind of got started, but also why you are such a really great person to talk to about this subject for today, getting the most out of your people. So, all right. So before we jump into our questions for the day, last thing I want to highlight for everybody is some of the principal themes that we're going to try and cover on today's conversation. So we're going to try and get to these subjects based on the questions that y'all pre-submitted. Now, what we've done is we compiled all of those questions and we tried to arrange them into a conversational format or one that really made sense for the subject matter of each question. Now, we obviously weren't able to use everybody's questions, and we probably won't get to everyone's questions today. However, if you have joined us today and made spending time with Powerfly a priority, then we want to make you a priority. So if you have a question, whether it was pre-submitted or not, please, please, please feel free to ask your questions during today's session. We want to make sure that y'all understand you get to drive this. So you came to spend time with us, get the answers that you want to ask, or to the questions that you want to ask, I'm sorry, while we're on the line today. So like we said earlier, you can either ask your question, come off mute to ask your question, or add a comment. You can also do that in the Zoom chat for everyone, or you can DM me directly. Just instead of sending to everyone, you'll use that little drop down and just send your question to me, Meg-Powerfly. So while we're doing that, again, just a quick reminder, make sure that you remain on mute unless you are actively speaking. Try not to interrupt another guest or our guest speaker, and feel free to interrupt me. So what we're going to try and cover today are the following things. We're going to talk about some practical techniques for building a high-performing team. We're going to talk about how to keep that team motivated and engaged once you've built it up. As well as maintaining a culture of high standards, even with volunteers, which I'm really excited to talk about this, because I know it's kind of one of those things that you sort of feel sometimes like you get what you pay for, and maybe if you have volunteers, you can't hold them to as high a standard. But Diana's here to talk to us about why that's not actually the case. So let's see here. To get us into the first round, like the first question that was posed to us today, one of the people had written in saying, how did you attract the talent to begin with? What kind of incentive structure have you found to work best for those looking to employ people in the nonprofit space?
Awesome question. Thanks, Meg. I think the most important thing any employer should do when they're looking to attract talent, and that's whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, is really being clear about what you think your value proposition is for your employees. Right? Like, recruiting to fill a role is a bit like dating in my mind, right? Like both sides need to feel that click, and both sides need to get something out of the relationship for it to work well, right? So like my main thing was like thinking about that deeply and then figuring out how to market it well, right? And so for example, at NeighborShare, I really think our value proposition has been threefold. There's first and foremost, we have a really critical and urgent social impact mission that it's like a hole out in the world that's out there to be filled, right? For those who are looking to also fill that particular hole in their lives, perhaps. We're also giving people a real opportunity to join an entrepreneurial adventure, right? And to come and join and build something from the ground up. And, it ends up being a really great developmental and growth opportunity for people where, they can basically play a level or two up from what they're currently doing at their company. And also, once again, join a whole entrepreneurial venture without needing to quit their day jobs, right? And then last but not least, we thought hard about, providing just a really great community and network. Like, even though we're not able to pay you, we can pay it forward. Right. So I can't even tell you the number of business school recommendations I've written, job references I've done, like it's a team of people that's comprised of good people doing good work. And we also have a fantastic network with ridiculously accomplished people. And so we're here to help each other out. Right. And so when you sort of have that set of value propositions, like recruiting for the team has actually been much easier than I thought it would be. And I think it's partly because we're really crisp about our message and what we're looking for. And then, lastly, in terms of how to literally go find those people, like we basically do what we do everywhere across the business, which is you hustle, right? Like, our most effective method, which was true for my previous jobs, actually, which is interesting, is, of course, via referrals from our current volunteer base. So really, like to talk to your current team members, really think about sort of, hey, like friends, family, colleagues, et cetera, who has a skill set that might be relevant for us, who you think might be interested in our mission. And then we've also done everything from, working with recruiting firms to find specific people, reaching out to alumni networks, like right now we're building an army of college ambassadors. So we're talking to a lot of colleges. Like you can also get really creative as you look to find that good fit.
That's so awesome. And I love the idea of kind of using that connection as, kind of for both sides, right? You have that incentive that yes, you're volunteering your time for this, but it's connecting you with all of these people that also have their own, niche markets or their own, spheres of influence where they can, like you said, write a recommendation or help connect you to somebody that might be a really great fit for your professional life in addition to this volunteer work. The one thing that I am a little curious about, so apologies if this is a little bit of an unscripted question for you, but I know that something that's really common with traditional hiring practices with most companies is that if you rely on a word of mouth or like a personal recommendation from another employee or another group member, you sometimes can limit the I don't want to say limit the diversity, because diversity is not a person, but you get to a little bit more of a homogenous look for your people that are in the room, because people tend to know more people like them. So is this at all a concern for NeighborShare? And if not, what do you think goes into that?
I love that question, Meg. And, in fact, it was actually a topic at a recent board meeting where like diversity from the board on to the rest of the team is a really, really important priority for us. And it's something that we're constantly worried about, because I feel like if you don't worry about it, it can slip, right? And so really thinking through, how do we make sure we're reaching out and, building out diversity and representation from all sorts of angles. Right. And so I would say that, in the current state of our team, I'm really proud of what we've built out. And then there's definitely areas to improve. And then to your point, it's sort of like, that's why we work through those multiple methods and multiple ways to recruit. Right. It's not just about referrals. So that's been like a really, really effective way of doing so. It's also reaching out to sort of other networks that aren't as overlapped to try to just find the really, really awesome people out there who might want to join our mission.
How easy is it, or how easy has it been to really identify areas where you don't have the depth or nuance of experience that would allow you to provide a better service using NeighborShare? Is it a situation where a need arises and so you're able to identify it, or is it something that is brought to your attention by like an outside source? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a bit of both, right? Sort of, when I'm thinking about what I need in our organization, whatever else, you start with your strategy, your goals, and org chart, and all of that, right? And then inevitably, as you're like, moving forward, you're like, oh man, like I also need one of these. I didn't even know what it was called. Like, and like I'm literally going through it right now, like yet another iteration of, thought we built out the marketing team that we needed. No, need 2 or 3 other expertises that you go. And so much of our theme of what we do is like just being agile. Right? Like being agile, turning the corners fast. And as soon as we learn it, let's go figure out sort of like the best way to go seek out the expertise or plug in the hole that we need. And, it's a pretty wild ride, but it's certainly a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I am just going to highlight for everybody, we're about a quarter of the way through today's chat. So please, please, please feel free to come off mute, ask your question. If we're going over one of your questions and you'd like to add context to it, that is always encouraged as well, because I know that depending on who reads the questions, there's a bunch of different ways that some of these can be taken. So let's make sure, I'll hold some space here, and I'll continue to do this sporadically throughout the rest of the chat. But I'm happy to hold some space in case anybody would like to come off mute and ask a question or submit it into the group chat. And I promise we don't bite. So if you do want to be the first person to come off mute, I know it's scary, but it's not the worst. So you're more than welcome to do so. If we don't have anybody that would like to step in, I'm happy to move on to our next question. This person had written in asking, how do you provide an experience that allows volunteers to tailor their work to what they're passionate about within your mission, while also making sure that the needs of the organization are met? And I feel like this is something that is maybe a little less of an issue when it comes to paid work, but for volunteer work, how do you strike that balance?
Yeah, great question. I basically probably approach it similar to how I'd actually approach it at work, right? Like, from the business end, you start out first with stepping back and really thinking through, what do you need, right? And so, we have a real org chart. We need to think about the skill sets that we need. We have job descriptions. We think about how much of that capacity do we need? And then we go from there and we look for it, and we look for that click, right? And then to your point, it's really all about striking that balance, whether you're hiring an employee or looking to recruit a volunteer. And so, we'll have explicit conversations with each candidate about, hey, like, what's the best fit for you in this org chart that we have? Like, given your background and expertise, I'd love to point you this way, but tell me what you want to do, right? Because especially in a volunteer type of setting, like the passion and motivation, a lot of it needs to come from within, right? And so it's really all about finding that right balance. And look, and at the end of the day, like, it doesn't mean each role is perfect either, right? Like, oftentimes you just have a lot of work to do, right? There's like grunt work to do on top of all the really awesome, challenging work to do, right? And that has to get done. And so even from that element, it's really about finding the right balance as well, right? Like, we all each take on enough of that just grunt work burden to get the job done, but then let's make sure we're pairing it well with really awesome, fun, and creative problem solving that we need to crack, so that, we can all stay energized while still pushing that ship forward, right?
Yeah, and I love that idea, because you're right. There's a certain amount of grunt work that just, it has to be done. This is the kind of stuff that powers really amazing machines like this. But, it's also a really great opportunity to ask people what they would like to do, because to be quite frank, there were many years in my career where being like the spreadsheet geek was my thing. Like, I wanted to own that document so that I knew what was happening at any given time. And that was my whole thing. And I loved it. I was able to do, kind of stretch that like OCD part of me and make sure that like all of our I's were dotted, all of our T's were crossed, everything, was great. So there are definitely people out there that would like to do those kinds of things. And by asking, what where you think that you would fit in this org, you can make the most of that kind of information, because not everybody wants to be front and center, but not everybody wants to be, sidelined or siloed into one specific area. All right, so let's move into a different kind of scope of this, talking about that on-the-job development. So how do you help develop your team when everyone involved has limited time to spend with the org? Do you have to prioritize who gets coaching and growth versus getting things done? Or is there a different way that you manage all of that?
Yeah, no, really, really good question. Meg, I'm a really big believer in the fact that the most effective lever for developing talent is on the job, right? Like, give people real responsibilities, stretch them to a reasonable amount, and give them the support they need to get the job done. And so that's what we do, right? I think each and every one of us at NeighborShare has grown and developed a ton just throughout this shared experience with each other. And it's funny, like, you're right, we don't have the time. I don't have the time on my end, and they don't have the time on their end, right, to do necessarily actual development sessions or things like that, even though I actually really love them in my normal day job and think it's a really important best practice. But basically it almost becomes like every meeting that we have on the NeighborShare end becomes a developmental one, because we're constantly problem solving, right? Like, the fun thing about an entrepreneurial startup is that no one knows what the right answer is, right? So we're constantly breaking into new frontier. And so, we're staring at what worked and what didn't. We're sharing ideas. We're like nudging each other this way, or what about that? And then through that, just by osmosis and just like the shared goal of let's problem solve, we learn a ton from each other, right? And so, like, for example, like we just had a board meeting yesterday, and if anyone listened in on that conversation, it would have sounded like we're just talking business, right, and getting the job done. But then, like, I walk out of that meeting and I'm like, geez, like, I just got some ridiculously awesome thought partnership and coaching and development for some really awesome industry leaders. Like, that was pretty cool, right? And so I think there's also an element where it's like important for the recipient of that ongoing development to absorb these experiences in that way, right? Like this notion that development doesn't necessarily always happen in some like discrete, like, hey, we're going to have a meeting today and you shall be developed, right? Versus it's a compounding effect through time, right? And so as long as you're sort of like staying open-minded and opening your ears for like what others are trying to teach you or problem solve with you to, for you to then absorb and try it on for size, like, I think that ends up once again just being one of the most effective levers around.
I'm just like picturing that idea of like, poof, you're developed. Like, it's not really a thing that happens all at once, and it's generally more of an organic thing. It sounds actually really similar to how Power to Fly functions, where if you know how to do something, great. If you don't, okay, we'll ask around, see if anybody else knows how. If they don't, then go off and figure out how to do it. Find a way that you think works, bring it back to the team. And if the team is like, hey, that actually sparks something for me. I didn't know, how to answer that question you had previously, but seeing what you're working on, there's an easier way to do it, and here's how you can do it. So I love that idea of like kind of making the development and the encouragement and growth of people really part of the process. We have a really interesting question that just came in the chat thread. Robin said, thanks for sharing all this amazing perspective so far. How do you handle a volunteer that underperforms? How is this the same or different than work in the profit sector?
Yeah, no, really, really great question. And I think the foundational principle is that, like, you can't let your standards slip, regardless of whether this is a paid employee or a volunteer that's underperforming. And so, it's funny, like, I run this team like a team I would run at Bridgewater, right? Like, you're evaluated as you come in, you join in this awesome mission, and hey, if you're not sort of pulling your end of the bargain, we're going to have conversations about it, right? And so have we ended up rolling off volunteers who, either couldn't deliver on the thing that they committed to, or just, didn't necessarily have the right level of expertise that we needed to have? Like, absolutely. The thing that probably is different a bit is because like we're this sort of like agile, fast moving shop, like we'll go through those cycles pretty quickly. Right. There's also not a commitment to say, hey, let's take 6 months to really develop you and teach you that thing or whatever. It's much more like, hey, if there's a great click, great. And if not, like, let's have a great conversation about where else you might be helpful. Right. Like, even if you're not on the core team, you can still remain a really, really awesome ambassador for our mission. And so please help us in those ways. But that first point I said is like, you can't let that bar slip though, because I really think excellence begets excellence. And, you really want to maintain that spirit and that culture so that everyone on your team feels that pride and feels that shared burden of carrying the thing forward without looking at others being like, wait a minute, like, why is that person slacking off and being allowed to do so, right?
So would you say that with NeighborShare, y'all are more accepting or flexible of people that maybe like they committed a certain amount of time and thought it would work, but then, things change and they now have less time to commit? Are you all accepting of kind of shifting that back and saying, okay, well, this person, they can't fill the 5 hours a week we thought we needed, but they can give us like, 5 hours every other week or something? Or is that not really the way NeighborShare has to function? Does it have to function more like if you were, trying to fill a seat in a limited number of seats per department or seats per role?
Right. No, we're great question, Meg. We're absolutely flexible and agile, right? Because at the end of the day, we're of course recognizing that we're running a volunteer-run organization. And so, my previous answer was really all about not lowering the bar for quality or for commitment. That in my mind is actually very different from, hey, like, I know like NeighborShare, no matter how much you love it, unfortunately will probably not be your first priority, right? You have your day job, you have your family, you have your 8,000 other things to juggle. And so the main thing that we ask of each other is just being really clear about like, setting expectations up front and being transparent. Right. And so when things, like we definitely have plenty of volunteers who go through moments of, hey, I'm getting really slammed at work, or hey, like I just actually switched a new job. And so it's gonna be crazy for a while. I might need to disappear for a month. Like that's totally okay. And as long as that, once again, we're communicating with each other and we're able to plan around that. Right. Because like in those instances, it doesn't mean the commitment's not there. It doesn't mean the passion isn't there and the interest to help out. It just means, no, we're juggling things. Right. And so like the key mantras I keep in my head with that is like agility and empathy, right? Like we're here to help each other out. And at the end of the day, like we're here to take care of each other.
Agility and empathy. I love that. Thank you so much. All right. So for when, obviously NeighborShare is your baby and you're very excited about the idea behind it and making it a reality and making it functional for people. How do you trust volunteers with your vision, as well as other, the management of other people in the group, in the org, in your absence? Because obviously you can't be everywhere at once.
Yeah, no, really, really good question. I think about this question in the NeighborShare space the same way I would think about it in my Bridgewater space, right? Which is, it's an exercise in taking calculated risks, right? And there's just a number of factors I would take into account when I think about those decisions, right? Like, first and foremost, how critical is the thing at hand to the business, right? Like, what's the impact if it doesn't go perfectly? Does it matter or does it not really? And it's okay, right? To give a volunteer or an employee just some space to grow and learn and make mistakes on their own. A second one is, hey, how well do I know that person? Right? Like, do I have a read yet of like what they're able to handle versus not handle? Sort of, so once again, I can map that against that first factor. And then, last but not least, there's also just like a practical element of like, hey, for the particular area that we're talking about, like how much training and context is actually required? Like, am I also making sure that I'm equipping, the folks on my team with the information that they need to do their jobs well, right? Because that I hold as my responsibility. And it's via that and investing in that then you're able to delegate out. And to your point, not have to be a part of everything. And so, to give a couple of tangible examples, I right now personally stay very close to anything content or brand related, right? Anything that leaves our doors, like I got to stay really close to, because we're still figuring out what our brand identity is, right? And every impression we make out in the world is a first impression that can last, right? And so, the content team and I would collaborate really closely, not because we don't trust each other, but because this is a critical thing to get right. And we want to really compound off of each other's thought partnership and expertise to really get that right balance, right? Or, another example is like we have this like fantastic bench of, pitch callers, we call them. Like these are folks who literally, go out to prospective nonprofit organizations all across the country to talk to them about joining the NeighborShare network. And this is hugely important for us because our whole mission is about empowering other nonprofits to sort of help their communities. And so without them, we have no business, right? And so, as you can imagine, it's pretty important that we make sure that these people are really well trained to represent our business well. We can handle the questions that come up and make sure that we're really showing a really credible, legitimate front to, the random nonprofit we're talking to in Star, Idaho, right? And so, for that, we actually have a whole process set up to really train them up, have them shadow, certify them, et cetera, before they go off on their own, right? And so sort of like there's different pieces that you calculate the risk, and then you build out machines and processes to sort of, once again, like be able to pull back through time.
Absolutely. All right. So in the course of that training, as you're like, kind of getting people up to speed and making sure that they're going to be, like you said, like a great ambassador for this, for this org, what do you think about giving critical feedback to volunteers? How have you had, in your experience, have you had to balance kind of that being empathetic, but also holding people accountable? And if so, like, how have you managed to make that work?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Look, I do think it's really important to be upfront and honest with feedback, right? Because like without it, standards will slip and then we're not going to get the job done, right? And then our job is so critical. We're here to try to help communities and families through moments of critical need, right? And then at the same time, to your point, Meg, I think it's really important to balance that with like an environment that's also just open-minded, empathetic, optimistic, and most of all, just fun, right? Like no one's looking for a stressful volunteer gig on top of their stressful job and their stressful lives, right? And so, and at the same time, like the thing we're doing is like super hard. Like our volunteers, like they're not coming in and licking envelopes, right? Like they're coming in and helping me crack like these really new problems that no one else has cracked before. And so, a thing that we do even in the midst of like giving each other feedback and adjusting things as we go is, we really try to promote this beginner's mindset, right? Like we're all entrepreneurs in this space and we're all trying to figure out something really important and really hard together. And so like, don't worry about sharing an idea or trying to experiment and it turns out not to be a great one. No one knew what the right answer was anyways, right? But if that idea turned out to not be one that didn't work or wasn't great, like we should call it what it is too, right? Like we shouldn't say like, oh, like that was good. No, it was a bad idea. Got it. Like, let's like, take a pivot, take a turn and do the next one. So I think it's about balancing those things while not, losing the essence of the message when it needs to be sent.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question that came in the chat here. This person says, hi, Diana. It's from Kate, sorry. Hi, Diana. I would love to hear about your experience building the NeighborShare team from scratch, i.e. how did you rally the team around the shared mission, enable collaboration and camaraderie, especially in a virtual world? So let's talk a little bit about that. Like maybe just like a high view of kind of the nuts and bolts of how things progressed from just an idea with you to building out a team.
Yeah, no, I love that. And great question, Kate. Thank you. Like the NeighborShare team started out with a bang, really, right? Like we were a small team of volunteers, actually all at Bridgewater Associates at the time, who, had this spark of an idea and really just wanted to make it happen. And so literally it was, we all had our day jobs. It was like nights, weekends, whatever it took. Within, 7 weeks, basically built up, a prototype that was working that we kicked off to pilot with others, et cetera. And then within a very short order, we're helping real families on the ground. And I think like that spark really helped us because, there's like this notion of like momentum begets momentum, right? So like once we like sort of saw that we had enough of a concept, saw that we like, wow, like we're hitting a vein here. Like we haven't figured out all the pieces yet. We still haven't figured out all the pieces yet, right? Like the whole thing still might not work, but we've hit enough of a vein that ignited the energy. Right. And then from there, we kind of just kept on iterating as we went. Like I'd be embarrassed to show you the number of strategy decks I have at this point. And like, even when I look at something from like 3 months ago, I'm like, ooh, I really thought that. Like we're just constantly learning and pivoting. Right. And then once again, just really recruiting and getting the message out there to get folks excited about our mission. And then in terms of how do we then keep folks motivated, especially in this remote world? And it's a really good question because it's interesting. Like, NeighborShare has only ever existed during the pandemic. I still haven't personally met over probably 50% of the volunteers that I have. And there's some that I probably will never meet unless I end up in, Colorado or Arkansas, right? Which hopefully I will one day. I'd love to meet all our volunteers and all team members, but it's the reality of the remote world, right? So I think there were a few key levers that have worked really well for us that I think is also relevant for any other team, right? like first and foremost, I really think it's about giving your team members the space to be true owners of your goal with you, right? Like give them the room to take risks and be creative with you. Because I feel like when individuals, the more ownership an individual feels in that end goal and that mission, I feel like the more naturally they'll just put more of themselves into the thing, right? Because they become self-driven at this point. So it's all about like you're coming in and you're taking a responsibility, you're not just taking on a task, right? And a second thing is about really taking the time to prioritize building and nurturing community, right? And especially in this day and age of COVID, most of us have even met. Like it's really funny. I really feel like we probably have some volunteers who will walk down the street and I won't recognize them because it's actually really hard to tell how tall or short someone is on Zoom. Like that's something that literally happens. And so, like what I was finding in the early days when I wasn't explicitly prioritizing it that as much, like we were losing volunteers, right? Like we were bringing on volunteers who were super excited about the mission and whatever, but then as things get busy and whatever else, like you kind of lose touch, right? And at that point, sort of like if I'm the one who's really maintaining that drumbeat and whatever else, if I didn't create a mechanism to build that community and network and sense of we belong in this way together, like we were literally losing people because we kind of get distracted by other things, right? And so, like things that we've put into place include, for example, like a weekly team meeting, which like I actually debated that a lot. Like, we have on average, 15 to 20 people show up for that weekly team meeting. Like that's a lot of man hours, especially when, I only have so many man hours or woman hours to be able to use, right, as a volunteer. But it was like interesting when I keep on asking the team for feedback. Hey, should we continue these? Should we do them bi-weekly? How should we deal with this? And everyone voted, hey, I might not be able to make every week, but let's keep these weekly. Like it was such an important forum to kind of reconnect and come back together and sort of just realign on where we are on the field, celebrate successes together, and just really like stay connected to what the rest of this, pretty sprawled out and complicated organization is doing. And then that ties into the last factor, which in my mind is really about constantly reinforcing our mission, our vision, and our path forward. Right. And like there are moments when I feel like I'm a little bit of a, like someone on repeat, like, hey, like, does the team need to hear this again? But I think it's actually really important, right, to constantly emphasize, hey, guys, reminder, we're here to do this. Here are top 5 priorities for the quarter, and here's how we're doing. And like, and just as importantly, and then celebrate the moments of success. Right? Like it's such hard work. And like, once again, people are doing this on top of their already really busy day jobs and their families and all that stuff. And it's about celebrating the success and then also sharing in it, right? Like every single volunteer on my team, I feel deserves the credit for each step that NeighborShare moves forward. It's not about like one person over the other, like we're in this shared mission. And so those are some of the ways that work to keep the team just motivated, engaged, and, ready to go for the next round.
I love that because you're right. I mean, it can be hard enough to keep people being paid and all in one physical location, motivated and focused and united on one goal. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Angie has written in the chat saying, brilliant insights, Diana. I especially love your ideas of non-monetary incentives for volunteers, like development opportunities, letters of recommendation, etc., as well as the normalizing of bad ideas through the beginner mindset. She says, I'm curious, since your workforce is all volunteer and you will probably come and go through time, how do you think about maintaining institutional knowledge and succession planning? I think this is really awesome. And then we also do have another person that's going to come off mute to ask their question once we're done with this.
Fantastic. No, really, really good question, Angie, and probably one that I haven't cracked through well for NeighborShare yet, though it's certainly something that I've dealt with in my sort of previous roles and things like that. I think there's like a lot to do with just thinking through continuity and also documentation, right? Sort of like everything that we do and all the ideas that we share and whatever it is, like we try to keep everything just really organized. And then as one volunteer rolls off and brings on the other one, we have this continuous stream of just training people as we go, right? So there's this constant transfer of knowledge that's happening. The other thing that kind of, I guess, behooves us is like we're constantly pivoting anyways. And so the thing that would have been relevant 6 months ago kind of isn't relevant now. And so the thankful thing that right now, at least, is like as we're agilely, moving through the team quickly and also building the business quickly, it's also a short time period to catch someone up. So the ramp up's like really, really fast. And then I think through time, at some point we'll likely want to bring on some paid full-time people, right? Like as there's enough complexity and scale, I do think that there'll be certain types of positions that'll be hard to maintain with just 100% volunteer force. And I think once those people come on board, we'll be able to, build out a bit more formalized and structured type of mechanisms to really enable that.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of those things that's like, it's a very unsexy part of business, right? Of like the documentation and maintaining these kinds of things, especially in a situation where these things and the protocols and the ideas change so rapidly that, you know, your documentation could take a very long time and a lot of man hours to produce and be completely obsolete within a matter of days.
Right.
So yeah, that's amazing. And thank you so much, Angie. That was a really great question. Caitlin, you have your hand raised. Would you like to come off mute and ask a question or comment or anything else?
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, guys. I was having trouble in the chat room, so I'll ask my question. Hi, everyone. So many familiar faces. I was curious, Diana, how you went about like building the business in terms of like scoping out your direction. You know, you guys had this high level idea of need, but how did you research what was needed? How did you do the product to market fit? And how do you continue to do that?
Yeah, no, really, really great question. And probably the biggest question I have on my mind always, right? Because we're still, once again, early in that process and constantly trying to figure out product market fit. And so, you know, like the way we did it is sort of like you start out with a basic idea and you just test it out fast and you fail fast, right? So like literally from day one, what we did was like ton of research into the space, right? Like my whole group of volunteers, none of us come from the nonprofit space. We all come from more business corporate backgrounds. And so it's one, rapidly getting our heads around the competitive landscape, what's out there, what's working well, what are the best in class examples we should network into to learn from, you know, just getting sort of like that one-on-one basis of things. And then you just try stuff out, right? So even in the early pilots that we did last year, we rapidly learned, you know, things like, hey, there's definitely something here that's working, right? Like once again, we've hit a vein in some way. We know our formula isn't perfect, but there's something there that can become really, really big. We also gathered data though, like it was interesting. Hey, like, you know, in terms of the types of needs we were putting onto our site, it was clear that the smaller types of needs were moving faster, right? Like for some reason, donors are feeling more connected to the ones that were, you know, a couple $100 or whatever it is, versus let's say the needs that were thousands of dollars for backed up rent. All of the spectrum is obviously really, really important, but like there was like a clear feedback mechanism that we were seeing, right? And then, for example, in that one, our hypothesis was like, there's probably something to do with donor psychology there, right? Where like, you know, if you only have, you know, $10 or $25 to donate, it probably feels more satisfying to help close that with like a need that's a bit smaller versus something that feels like a drop in the bucket, right? And so via data and staring at that, that's how we came up even with this concept of, hey, we're here to help with needs of $400 or less. Right. And so like literally week by week, month by month, you just learn new things and you continue to pivot. And so much of last year, before I jumped into this, you know, whole endeavor full time was so much about just doing that research and just constant pivots and debates. Right. Or, you know, this framing of like, hey, we're really here to empower the frontline heroes. Right. But that was a huge debate, which is like, well, like, should it only be really relying on frontline heroes or should we just open it up to anybody? Right. Like if you have a need, just post it. And then we ended up deciding, no, like that's actually one of the unique insights in our model that could be a make and break for us, right? In terms of like, you know, we're using really awesome third parties who can really validate to a donor that this need is really real. And in fact, not only is it real, it's at risk of being unmet. Because in my job as a case manager, I'm already making sure that all the other resources that are available to us are being applied. And then even then though, this need's about to slip through the cracks. Right. And so like every element that you hear, even in my mission statement, whatever, like it came from actually weeks and months of thinking, feedback, etc., to just sort of like drive it to that thing. And then I would bet if we do this chat 6 months from now, I'll have like a lot more new insights to share with you. Right. And that's partly what's really fun and exciting about this whole endeavor.
Cool. Thank you. That's really great. Appreciate it.
Caitlin.
Thank you for that amazing question, Caitlin. I am going to hold a little bit of space here in case anybody else would like to follow Caitlin's example and come off mute to ask a question. Please feel free. If we don't have any takers, then in the last about 15 minutes, because these chats always go way too quickly. So but in the last 15 minutes, we'll kind of go over some of the more broad reflections about both you know, Diana's experience with NeighborShare, as well as what you can take from it to manage your own teams. It looks like we don't have anybody quite yet, but please feel free to. So Diana, one of the next questions we were asked says, what skills or experiences from your career prior to starting NeighborShare were critical and really transferable to this new endeavor? And what strategies from your last role have proven effective or not in this one?
Yeah, no, really, really good question. And you know, like I think my overall answer is like, geez, like almost everything I know about being an executive came from my 15 years of really intense training at Bridgewater, right, which is where I previously worked. And, so much of it has applied to what it means to build a business as a first-time CEO in in a startup space, right? Like everything from how do you think about setting goals and vision and strategy, right? How do you approach these new frontiers and gain that right level of conviction before you make a bet and make a decision, right? Like how do you organize and orchestrate this like massive team of volunteers and board members and advisors and things like that? And then also things like, how do you be intentional about the culture you want for your organization, how to maintain it? And so like, I don't know that there's anything that I learned in that job that doesn't apply 100% to this one. The thing that's been more interesting is there's also just been a lot that's new that I never had to do that now I do have to know and do as a first-time CEO in a completely new to me space, right? And so there's sort of, in addition to the really strong baseline I had, it's much more about filling gaps in spaces that I just never had to deal with before, right? Sort of like, I run a tech startup. I don't know how to run a tech team. That's interesting. Like, how do I go about doing that? How do I make sure I'm hiring the right people? How do I make sure I'm bringing in the right advisors to do so, right? Or, right now I'm deep in the throes of figuring out building our, PR and media strategy. Know zero about it. Literally was, Googling PR 101. How do I think about this? How do you think about finding the right agency? Who can you trust? And all that stuff. And so there's been a ton of learning and growth for me in those spaces, but a lot of it is taking sort of the fundamental skill set I learned before and just applying it into, once again, new frontiers, new areas of content, and then sorting it out that way. And then, not least of which is pull in the experts, right? Like use your network, pull in the experts to ask your questions because, certainly I'm not trying to do the thing of let me become an expert in anything. I just need to know enough to be a little bit dangerous and know what advisors I need to pull in.
Excellent. All right. Is there anything from your prior experience that you pulled forward into NeighborShare and had no idea or had, a very rude awakening of this is not the way to do this? Because I think that's one of the things that people tend to rely on when they're starting something new is what in your experience has prepared you for this? I know how I did this before and it worked, so let's try it here. So what has been maybe either your greatest surprise or your greatest okay, well, back to the drawing board sort of moment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've run into really big, back to the drawing board type moments, but there's certainly dynamics that are different, right? Like there's something, of course, very different from running things in a very profitable company to being hello, you have $0 in budget, a really huge vision, and you want to move really fast. So how do you do that, right? And so sort of certainly with some of those constraints that we have, it's forced a different form of hustle basically and cleverness to get jobs done, even when you might not have all the resources available to you that you're used to, right? And it's like both hustle in terms of being really creative and clever about how you get the job done. And it's also something about I think I've just developed more of a bravery and thickness of skin to go ask for help, right? This mantra of well, if you don't ask, you'll never get a yes. And so let's go out there and do that, right? So it's I do think in those ways, I've changed my approach a bit that, will compound through time, I think, in shaping sort of who I ultimately will become as an executive in the future, right? And then the other thing that's probably shifted a bit is as I mentioned before, I think all the factors that one needs to consider in running a team and keeping them motivated, engaged, and all that stuff, I think all the factors stay the same, right? When I mentioned things like agility and accountability and empathy. But I do think the formula of how strong of a dose to put on one factor versus another, I do think that shifts given sort of the context that I'm in as a volunteer or whatever, right? Sort of agility, always really important, I think, in any professional setting we're in, but agility in terms of our capacity, whatever it is in a volunteer space, hugely high, right? Because once again, the amount of turnover we might go through at a particular point in time is definitely higher than what you would expect in sort of a normal sort of corporate situation with paid roles and things like that. And so it's more about taking the foundations and then rejiggering a little bit to then make it fit the new context versus anything that's well, that definitely worked before and this doesn't fit in this space. I don't think I've experienced anything like that before.
So as we talk about that gap between nonprofit volunteers and a for-profit, team of people that are employed to do this role, what has been the biggest difference working with those two teams that you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's not been as different as you would think. it's like, once again, that dynamic I was talking about earlier about like the factors become either stronger or weaker. And if anything, like, like the biggest thing, of course, is like, I do always wish that I had more of my volunteers' time. Right. It's sort of like, if anyone would listen to me, I'd talk to them about NeighborShare day in and day out and all sorts of things. Right. And like, you're not able to do that. Right. It's sort of like, nope, Diana, like, calm it down. Like, you should respect their boundaries. They're really busy at work right now or whatever. So it's more like that element of almost like managing myself to be like, hey, like, let's corral like Simon a bit. Let's give them some space. And then when we're ready to talk and have their time budget for NeighborShare, then let's chat about those things. So I think that's probably like the most different piece, because otherwise, in terms of what I feel with our team, in terms of shared mission and commitment, like the willingness for people to really roll up their sleeves and work really hard, like, geez, like, it's sort of, one of my favorite parts, I think, about this whole endeavor and also about 2020 is like this reminder via meeting the people on my team that like, people can still be fundamentally good, right? Like, sort of like through all of the darkness of last year and whatever else, I just met these really awesome people who are so selfless and giving in terms of the, no, let's just go build this mission because we're there to help people.
So what advice do you have for someone who has an idea for a social venture or a nonprofit project, but doesn't know where to start? Because I mean, like, I feel like there's always, in entrepreneurship, the idea or the mantra that an idea isn't really worth anything. It's what you do with it. So let's talk a little bit about, what those first steps should be for someone.
Yeah, no, really, really good question. I think at, first thought there is like, look, like, I feel like that first step is always the hardest, like, to your point of like going from the, but it's an idea, or, oh, it's scary, I don't even know if it's a good one, et cetera, into like doing something, right? So I feel like step one is like, push yourself to just take a step. It doesn't need to be a gigantic momentous step. No one's saying go quit your job or go crack this thing overnight, whatever it is, but like, just do something to get the wheels turning, right? And, for myself, it started with research. Like, like for me, like, I love going into new spaces and into white space to learn about things, but at the same time, I like to be really, really informed or else it'll stress me out, right? And so for me, I started with research. Like, I didn't really know anything about this space. And so I just started reading a ton. I asked to get connected to folks in the nonprofit industry, executive directors, et cetera, who are just willing to answer my really basic questions, right? And then from there, I was able to develop a sense of, interesting. This is like basically, and it's weird to say competitive landscape because we're in the landscape of helping people, but like, you know what I mean? Like the competitive landscape and understanding sort of, once again, the shape of the thing. Is our idea unique enough to really pursue, or has it already been done? Okay, if it's flavor of it's been done, what do we think is actually unique and differentiating about our thing that's worth still driving and whatever else? And then from that first step, and depending on the pace you want to go, and then by the way, there's no right or wrong pace, right? Like, do it at the pace that makes sense for you. Then you'll be better equipped to then figure out the next step, right? Once you have that level of understanding, and then you kind of go from there. And then one of the mantras I also continue to hold is like, and then from there, after that initial step, like, just start small and humble, right? Like, once again, we don't need to try to like cure the world overnight. Start with like an inkling. Do a small experiment, prototype something quickly, and just get it out there in the world. Like, the best way you're going to know whether or not this thing is going to work is get real feedback from other people, right? And so just, and then you just kind of keep on building, and hopefully the snowballing effect will happen through time.
Okay, so how did you know when it was time to leave your previous career? Because obviously what you're talking about is about starting small and making some small things first, some small moves first, makes a lot of sense. But how did you know when it was time to leave, or when it was time to, kind of dive headlong into a new thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting, because like, certainly if you asked me at the beginning of 2020 what I'd be doing career-wise, it definitely wouldn't have been the, hey, I'm gonna like jump from the job I've loved and done for 15 years to go into a completely new space in a philanthropic setting, right? And so, it's interesting, like, I don't think for me it was a good decision to really leave my previous career. Like, I really love my company and I wasn't actively looking for a change at all. It was much more a decision to step toward this newly found passion and mission that I was having a hard time just shutting down my mind from, right? And so like, basically what had happened was, we founded NeighborShare. It started as sort of like a nights and weekends passion project. And then as we picked up more momentum and as our vision grew bigger, it became just really apparent that like, hey, this thing is needs and is deserving of someone full-time who's going to live and breathe it. And so actually what happened, it's funny, like over the summer, I actually started a CEO search for NeighborShare. Like I was like, hey, like that wouldn't be me, but let me find someone and then maybe I can be a board member or whatever else. And it was really funny because I got introduced to this guy who's now a board member, and he was like, you don't need me to be your CEO. Like I'll be on your board advisor, whatever. I love this idea. He's like, you should do it. Like, you know, you have the capabilities, you have the passion. Like, why not give this thing a try? And so, so I came upon it somewhat unexpectedly, basically, right? Where it's sort of like the thing was picking up enough momentum that I knew I couldn't continue it while doing my full-time job. And then, you know, really having a moment of reflection of, hey, like, I don't think I can really walk away from this opportunity either, right? Between the combination of just this strong belief that this mission can really go somewhere and hopefully help lots and lots of families across the country. And then two, also this notion of, you know, I also really liked what this whole adventure was doing to me as well, right? Like it was making me braver, more confident. I was like learning about new things, networking everywhere. Like it's sort of like, hey, like I really didn't want to let go of that opportunity either, right? And so at the end of the day, what I did was like, it was a calculated risk, right? Like the way I thought about it was, the worst that happens is that we end up not helping as many people as we'd like, but we're still helping people, right? And then either way, I was 100% confident that I was going to come out of this on the other end, completely step changed as an executive and an entrepreneur. And I was like, that's a pretty good risk profile. Like that's pretty good, right? And so that's why I decided to you know, like take at least this time to really give this thing a go.
Thank you for sharing that. All right, so we have a really great question that just came in the chat. I want to make sure we get to it before the end of today's session. Can you talk and tell us a little bit about like a moment or a milestone that was particularly impactful and meaningful to you in this journey from starting NeighborShare to where you are currently? Yeah, I'll just leave it like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. Like there have already been just so many, you know, and I think that's partly what drives our energy and the team's energy to keep on moving forward, right? Like the first milestone of getting our website up and running within like 7 days and actually kicking it off to a real pilot with friends and family and having real money flow through to help families, like that was amazing, right? And then from there, you know, when we recruited our first board member who like didn't know us, didn't have any reason to do us a favor, quote unquote, but just loved us for the idea and the energy and the quality of the team, that was really amazing and validating too, right? You know, then like it's sort of like, as I think through it, there's like all these just great milestones that we keep on running into that just keep on sort of like validating this belief of like, hey, let's keep on going. Once again, there's lots of problems to solve, lots of things we haven't figured out, but there's something really here, right? And you just get these great moments that just reinforce your confidence to keep on going, even as you go into unknown territory, right?
I love that. This has been such a really great and energizing chat. I want to make sure that we don't lose momentum on this. I'm going to highlight a couple of things that I've put in the chat so far. So one is a link to where you can check out upcoming virtual events for Power to Fly, but I also put another link in there. If you are interested in chats on entrepreneurship, you can search our video archives by keyword. So I've linked a search that will give you everything that comes up if you look up entrepreneurship. But like we're not exactly Google. So if you have, try different search terms, try different tenses, try, plurals and singulars. There's a lot of different things that you can find in this, in our amazing video archive. I just want to highlight a little bit more about NeighborShare. So Diana, why don't you take it away and let people know, what you'd like them to take away from today's session.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, first of all, once again, thank you so much for everyone just joining in this chat and learn. Just really, really appreciate your support and you being here. I do hope that, there's at least some tidbit or insight or thing that we talked about that was somewhat helpful or just something helpful to think about. And, the thing here is like, yeah, like if you're interested at all in learning more about NeighborShare, if you have more questions for me, whatever else, like, please get in touch with me. I'd love to talk. I'm at diana@nbshare.org. And then also last but not least, like, please also go and help a neighbor today. We have, real stories of need, real and urgent stories of need on our site from folks all across the country, from our partners. And so would also really love that. We're just at nbshare.org.
That is so wonderful. Thank you so much, Diana. This has been, it's really great to get to learn more about your organization. Like I said, even in my research prior to this, I didn't really grasp the full, the full scope of what you're creating here. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Meg.
Again, a huge thank you to our amazing audience. Y'all submitted some really great questions ahead of today's session and some amazing ones during. I really, really, really appreciate the participation. It just makes these events so much more dynamic and impactful for everyone. So as we go out and leave today at the end of our Thursday, hopefully you are similarly, kind of revved up and excited and ready to tackle either whatever you have for the rest of this week, or maybe whatever pet projects or passion projects that you might be working on in your off hours. Thank you again for taking time out of your day to join us. It always means a lot to us. And I hope to see many more of you join us for upcoming sessions. We've got a lot of great chats happening next week, as well as our May mini summit. It's happening May 3rd through the 6th. The focus for that summit is going to be inclusion in finance. So whether you are part of the financial industry and want to, kind of join in and see what's on the forefront there, or if like me, finances are, not, it's something kind of murky, right? It's something I don't really know a ton about. So definitely join us no matter where you're coming from. It's going to be a really awesome learning experience for everybody, and as well as talking about inclusion in finance and how so many people and so many markets have been shut out of the financial sector, and really understanding about how finances, investments, all this kind of stuff impacts our daily lives. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you around on some of our upcoming chats. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone.